So, welcome to our session. We have the pleasure today of having Jon Young with us. He is author of What the Robin Knows about bird language, and was also the founder of Wilderness Awareness School, and also teaches the art of mentoring, is well known throughout the world, and really grateful to have Jon with us today. And thanks, Jon, for coming on.
Yeah, well, thanks, Lee, for inviting me. It's always fun to have a good conversation.
Great. Well, Jon, why don't we start off by just having you tell us a little bit about your background, where you grew up, how you got involved in nature, and, what were some key moments when you were young?
Yeah. Well, I was born in 1960 in New Jersey, in a little town called Red Bank, a little city, and on the Navesink River, which is really a bay. But I had two working parents who were very loving, and I have an older sister. She's 3 years older than me, and lived in a neighborhood which was basically an old apple orchard. It was one of the first neighborhoods that came into old farmland there. It's kind of was at that time a sleepy sort of bedroom community for New York City. Like the train line came down from Manhattan, and so there was little neighborhoods that were beginning to encroach into these big open wild spaces, which used to be farms and forests and things like that. So I had this kind of mixture of suburban upbringing and the freedom of wandering thousands of acres to different fishing holes and so on, and had a love for fishing from a young age that was implanted in me by my my Polish relatives who all came over from Poland and settled in New Jersey and were farmers and hunters and fishermen, and then my Irish family, which did the same in the same area. So I had grandmothers on both sides of the family and uncles and aunties that were all outdoors people, and inspired me really from a young age to learn how to move with a fishing pole in my hand, and I'd ride my bike for miles alone back in those days to from pond to pond and catch fish and bring them home, because my Irish grandmother would say, well, if you catch us some fish, I'll help you clean them and we'll make them for dinner, So nothing a boy wants to do more than do something for grandma, So she was really good at that. And I would say that I spoke to her later in life after I'd grown up and done my research and had finished college, and was clear that there was a cultural web that passed through generations that the grandmothers held really strong to make sure that the children were connected to nature, And my grandmother had that growing up, but from her grandmother, Annie McCormick, and that was intact. And so she would, conduct little missions for my sister and I. And a lot of people had grandmothers, extended families, but I think I was the only person in the neighborhood who had a grandmother like Nanny Cecil. She really had a whole strategy. She'd send me out. She'd look at field guides with me from the age of 4. She'd look at these little golden guides, and she'd point out something that, according to the range map, is supposed to live around here, whether it was a painted turtle or a box turtle or a corn snake. And she'd say, have you ever seen this out there, Jonathan? Because I think they're around here. If you can catch one for Nanny, I would really appreciate that. So, one little session like that, she was so rewarding whenever I brought something back to her with attention and love and, long conversations and catching my stories and asking me loads of questions that, she could just spend 15 minutes with me and I'd be out for hours every day looking for those things, and I eventually figured out how to catch every single thing that was in the pond life book and the reptiles and amphibian book,
Yeah,
because of her.
is it there one special instance you caught a snapping turtle? I think
Well,
that.
that was years later,
Okay.
So when I was 10, I had already in we had moved to another home just a little ways away from the first home we lived in there, and I could ride my bike, back and forth between the old neighborhood and the new one, so it was, close by. That way I could keep in touch with my old fishing holes. But the new place gave me access to a whole bunch of new land, like 3,000 acres of, there were some beautiful sandy places, where the animal tracks were really clear. But at that point, I, hadn't discovered tracking per se. Um, But there was this one fishing hole where there was a snapping turtle that was stealing my bait in this one part of the pond. So if I went to that one part of the pond, I couldn't fish for very long before the turtle would come in and scare all the fish away. It was a great big snapping turtle. And I told my dad about it. He said, well, if you can catch me that snapping turtle, I'll make you the best snapping turtle soup you ever tasted. And that's all he had to say to me. I don't think he realized that I actually would do it. Because the turtle, I weighed about 60 pounds and the turtle probably weighed 45 pounds. And
Wow. That's a big snapping turtle.
well, right. And it occurred to me on the way down to that pond that I actually couldn't, if I caught it, I wouldn't be able to get it home. Right. There would be no way for me to move it a mile through the woods and then a half mile through my neighborhood to my house. There was no way I could do it without help. So the last house on the right before you leave the neighborhood and cross into the mile of woods to get to the pond, there was the Cella family lived there, and Steve Cella was my age, and he was in the garage sweeping at the time. And I ran up to him and I said, "Do you want to catch the biggest snapping turtle you ever saw?" And he said, "Yeah." So he joined me. He didn't tell his mom he was leaving, which didn't work out very well. Or actually, maybe it worked out really well. And Steve and I ran all the way to the pond, and we had that turtle in like 5 minutes. And because there was two of us, we were able to get it back to the neighborhood. But as soon as we showed back up on his lawn with that turtle right at the stop sign in the corner, his mom spotted us, and she was so mad. And she grabbed him by the ear and walked him away, threw him in the car, and they drove off. And so now I'm standing on the street corner with this giant snapping turtle, and I can't get it home the rest of the way. And that was a fateful moment, because it was at that moment that my mentor, well, he's now my mentor for 51 years at this point, 50 years. And, I met him in 1971. So it's, the 50-year anniversary right now. He drove up and he saw me with this turtle. Now, he had had a upbringing with elders as well, who were amazing at nature connection. But his elder just happened to be one of the Apaches that escaped during the Apache Wars and lived in an enclave with other tribes and other Apaches, and kept their culture and skills alive, for decades. And after the wars stopped and, the West was settled, they became sort of cash. They wouldn't surrender. Let's just put it like that. And they just decided to live out their years maintaining their identity as Apaches, and they kind of came in and out of society on a cash basis, never got identifications. And that went on for many generations, even to this day. But that elder that raised my mentor was, his father was off the boat from Scotland, and he was first generation, born in America, Scottish, Presbyterian, hardworking family, 5 male cousins, 3 brothers, all that moved together from Scotland to America and raised their sons in Beechwood, New Jersey. And so, Tom Brown was an unlikely person to receive this mentoring, but it just so happened that he bumped into a boy on the beach one day when he was hunting fossils, who also was hunting fossils. And he happened to be with this Apache grandfather, who then ended up, mentoring Tom and his friend Rick for the next 11 years. And Tom was, I think, only 7 at the time. So he had a very, very deep connection with the land and tracking and bird language and, skills that, he could make anything out of anything. He knew what plants were good for medicine. And, he was just an extraordinary person. But I didn't know any of that when I met him. He was 21, I was 10. And his elder had said, I want you to find somebody to pass these skills on to the way I passed them on to you, and you'll know him by the sign that he carries. So Tom saw me on a street corner with a snapping turtle, asked me what it was. I told him it was a common Eastern snapping turtle. And he smiled and he said, that was only half an answer. He didn't say it out loud, but he wrote me a letter 10 years later when I turned 21, reflecting on that moment, and said that he saw that I was carrying Mother Earth on a string, which he took as the sign that he was looking for. And he then spent the next 9 years mentoring me in the way that grandfather had mentored him. But I'll tell you right now, if it wasn't for the grandmothers that I had and my uncles and aunts that kept me going from the very young age, he wouldn't have given me the time of day, because he basically needed me to be willing to go out on errands, solve mysteries, and come back and tell him the story. And I had already had 10 years of training with Nanny Cecil for that, so you can see the threads of culture from Ireland and from Poland coming through and giving me enough of a support to make me ready for somebody who had a whole lot more of the threads of culture than I did at the time. But yeah, that was a very formative moment.
Uh,
And from he wrote his first book in '78, The Tracker, and then he opened the Tracker School. So at the age of 19, when I was still in college, I was one of his first instructors, but I was already deep in research at university for how does deep nature connection pass between generations. And that's been my focus ever since. That's what I've been doing.
Wow. And just for our listeners, Tom Brown, amazing individual who really restarted, I should say, or reinvigorated this culture. North America have spawned off so many tracking schools, and obviously what John was just mentioning, his own experience, has had a tremendous influence. And yeah, that's an incredible story and a coincidence in quotes, if you will, the way that you met him. Um, what also, John, how did that ultimately lead to your involvement or founding Wilderness Awareness School?
Well, between '78 and '83, I was at Rutgers University, and I was doing some deep research on trying to understand why some societies, nobody's connected to nature, and why, while in other societies, everybody is. And I thought, well, in our modern times, we really need a lot more people to be connected to nature. And I think that we could learn some tools from the societies around the world that still had this nature connection thing intact. And, I researched the methods of my grandmother. I looked into Ireland and old lore there. I looked into Poland. I looked all over Europe for old stories of how this nature connection mentoring happened and when it stopped. When did it really get interrupted there? I looked into Asia. I looked into Africa, Australia, North and South America, even some Polynesian cultures, because I was really looking for, what could I learn? What could be modeled in a universal way that wouldn't be cultural appropriation, that would activate deep nature connection in people. And what's missing in the modern times. And at the time when I was doing this research, I was a part-time county naturalist for the park system, and I was doing a lot of environmental education. I started doing that as a volunteer at 16 for the park system through the Johnny Appleseed program. And then when I was 18, they hired me as a part-time naturalist, and I led nature programs, using environmental education methodologies. And I kept thinking, it's good that we're doing this environmental education, because some of these children, this is the only thing that they're going to experience for their whole childhood, right? They're going to get one day. They're going to come down from Newark in a bus. They're going to, park here. They're going to all get out of the bus, and I've got 5 hours with them to inspire them for the rest of their life, because maybe they'll never get this chance again, and I kept thinking, well, wait a minute, there's got to be a better way. What about the children that live right around me? Could I get a handful of those children involved in a program and do for them what Tom and my grandmothers had done for me? And I was thinking about that the entire time I was doing my research. So everything I researched, I intended to apply in a project. And when I graduated in '83, the project was called Wilderness Awareness School. And I started with 5 young high school guys that were from all boys Catholic high school who expressed interest after experiencing a one-day event I ran for them. And one of the teachers over there, Pat Tracy, she would drive them over to my farm on every Tuesday, and I'd spend time with them outside for an hour and a half, and she'd pick them up. And I did that every week for several months. And I was working in a restaurant that I was a partner in town to help pay the bills. And I met an elder there named Ingwe, who had been raised by the Akamba in East Africa and also the Bushmen in South Africa for his first 6 years. And he was, in his 70s at the time, and he was super interested in what I was doing and came out of retirement to help me. And the two of us grew that program from 5 kids to, we had 265 kids at one point, and then we got all these contracts with the state and, well, all kinds of different projects. We ended up, working with about 500 children a year. But some of those children were with us every week for years, and we were able to really really move a lot of children into deep nature connection. And then a lot of them went on to form schools like Dan Gardoki and the White Pine programs. And, a lot of other of those young people there went on to do this in their lives as well.
And
That's
then
how it started.
it migrated to Washington State eventually.
In 1995, we moved it to Washington State because the wilderness in New Jersey was all gone by then. So there was very few opportunities and less demographic interests, in the neighborhoods. But I was flying around doing adult programs around the country, and I kept getting so many people showing up at my programs, east of Washington there in the foothills of the Cascades, that we decided, well, we should move it here because people are actually interested, and there's still wilderness. There's still places for us to be able to do this locally, because that was the key. If you wanted to do it every week, you needed access every week. It was getting harder and harder to do that in New Jersey, and there was less and less interest, and it was more and more expensive. So we thought, okay, let's move to Washington and we'll fly back to New Jersey to do adult programs, which is what we ended up doing. And I worked, that year, 95. I actually started to move in 94, but moved there in 95. I began training people in 94 out there. And between 95 and 99, I trained all the staff to take over, because I became interested in teaching the model now that made Wilderness Awareness School successful. I became interested in teaching that. You referenced it, the art of mentoring, and I began going all over the world teaching it to other communities so that other projects could develop locally. And now I've lost count. There's over 1,000 local projects, doing the same kind of work with children all over the world.
That's incredible, and I'm fascinated by this idea of nature connection, both from just an intellectual level, but also just my own personal experiences and how valuable it is. What are some of the gateways, if you will, into nature connection? So let's say bird language or wildlife tracking, and if you can explain to our listeners, how does that differ from what normally in our society we hear about when we think of nature, in terms of recreation or education slash
Mhm.
science?
Yeah, that was one of the things that I had to figure out early on, because there was something different about what Ingwe and I had put together. Because Ingwe had experienced the same kind of upbringing that Tom Brown had and that I had, and we were, struggling, like, okay, because everybody thinks they understand nature connection. Okay, yeah, we basically bring people outside, and what we called the dragon brag in those days, drag people through the woods and brag about everything, sort of a show and tell kind of approach, right? But that's sort of like doing science outside, you know, and it's good, it's helpful, it's useful, and there's a time and place for it. But it does not necessarily result in connection. So we started to really look at the way people in modern times relate to nature. What is nature relationship? And we saw that some people love to go out in nature just to get the exercise and to recreate, right? It makes them feel better. So the motivation is, every time I do this, I come back feeling better. So that's not really nature connection, because people will mountain bike, or they'll surf, or they'll ski, right? Or they'll walk their dogs, because that's a legitimate way for people to recreate in nature, and it can lead to a lot of really cool connections. But it tends not to, because the recreation approach tends to be, go out there, exercise, breathe, enjoy yourself, have fun, laugh a lot, come back and feel good, right? And there's whole industries, billion-dollar industries that are in service to nature recreation. And I would also include in that, people who just walk in the evenings after work, or people who garden, right? So that's nature recreation. So kind of put that in the back of your mind. And then let's go over and look at nature education, right? And nature education is that the dragon brag approach, as I was talking about earlier. A bus pulls up, 30 kids get off, walk them through the woods, show them all the cool things that you can in the shortest amount of time possible, right? Give them a few experiences that they will remember, and then put them on the bus and say goodbye. It's based on science, and it's interpretive science, right? You're out in the field with people, and you're teaching them about the trees and ecology. And if you get close to a bird, you can point it out to them, but mostly you can't, because you got 30 kids with you. So you tend not to see wildlife up close, right? and that's nature education, and that's been around for a long time. The environmental ed movement has got that pretty well cornered, if you will, and um, people have experienced that. But again, recreation and education are not connection, and connection is something different. So the third category we identified was nature connection. And, if you look at, let's say, 1 million people in modern America, what percentage of them are likely to have experienced nature connection to the point where it moved the needle inside of them? And you're going to find it's a pretty low percentage. And basically, nature connection tends to happen when, for instance, children live on the edge of the woods, or they got a cool backyard with an old oak tree and some cool plants growing around it. And mom and dad are busy, and they tend to just spend a lot of time alone, just hanging out, laying on their back, looking up at the bugs, walking on the branches. It's nature connection emerges from the instinct for the children to slow way down and to feel the rhythm of nature in their own body, to get a little bit dreamy, basically. And they end up building relationships with that cool old tree in the backyard, or the little fairy garden that they make out of acorns and sticks and whatever. Um, if you leave children alone in nature for hours at a time every day, they'll quite naturally, instinctively bond with nature, and that's a deeper process. It's not intellectual. It's more kind of based on curiosity in the moment and a sense of timelessness,
And
right?
this is what you refer to as the unstructured playtime for kids, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yep. And it's very much driven by their imagination, and Richard Louv writes about that in his book, Last Child in the Woods, Saving Our Children from Nature Deficit Disorder, because he identifies that people in my generation and older, people born before or in the 1960s or earlier, there's a lot more people from those generations that experience nature connection, because it was before television got good. It was before internet got turned on. It was before video games and other things competing for our attention, got really well entrenched, right? So I grew up with 3 channels on the television, and it wasn't very good half the time, so you didn't really depend on TV for your entertainment. You came in and watched certain things, and you knew what time they were, so you set aside those times. I love Bugs Bunny, for instance, right? Um,
And
but
and half the time it was a rerun anyway, right? So
yeah, and so there was, you know, there's a lot of research on that era in the U.S. mostly, but also Canada, and I also find that people in England and Germany and Australia, they have a very similar history, with when did nature connection sort of fall out of the population, and it started in the 80s, basically the late 80s and into the 90s. So modern influences that shifted the gross behavior of the population, because no, I don't think anybody really was intentional about nature connection. I think it was a side effect of busy parents and kids playing outside together in semi-organized, decentralized mobs. The kids would all go out in the morning, and they'd all find each other, and they all go play in the woods and make dams in the creek and build forts. And the people from that generation know nature
that's
connection.
exactly what I did as a kid, and those are my fondest memories, honestly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So, and what it basically tells you is that children are hardwired for nature connection. They don't actually need adult supervision in order to achieve it. And when adults tend to supervise nature activities, they tend to move it towards either recreation or education, right? But it's usually a program, yeah? Whereas connection, again, it needs timelessness. It needs to be driven by the instincts and curiosities of individuals in the moment. It's a natural unfolding of the nervous system, right? And that points to the fourth category, which is where I specialized, and that is deep nature connection. So, we coined that phrase because one of the editors who worked on What the Robin Knows with me, he said, John, I've worked on, and he was a, retired New York Times editor. So he was a pretty severe, guy asked a lot of questions and wondered, John, are you talking nonsense here with this part about bird language? Because I've never experienced that. And I talked to one of my birding friends who's a birding expert. He says he's never experienced it. Are you sure you're not just making this up? And I'd be like, no, Mike, I know this is real. This really is. And here's an article that Dan Gardoki researched that points out that we know that this works, and he would read that and he'd say, well, that's really interesting because my bird watching friend doesn't know that, doesn't believe it's possible. And so he was very much a pushback against the things that I suggested for that book guy the whole way along. And then he said to me one day, hey, John, I want to put words in your mouth. I never do this when I'm editing for a writer. He said, I never want to change their voice or add something to it. But I really feel compelled to tell you a story and ask you if you would entertain, instead of calling this bird language, if you would want to call it deep bird language. And I'm like, Mike, now you're the guy who's sounding soft-headed. And he laughs. He says, I know. I can't believe these words are coming out of my mouth. He said, but I've worked on well over 100 books, and none of those books changed me. Meaning him as as a man, right? Mike, the writer, Mike Bryant, said, none of those books changed me. I could go in there and I could work on the manuscript. I could ask critical questions. I could get the author to get clear on certain pieces and this and that. He said, but, I started as Mike, and when I ended that book project, I was still the same old Mike. He said, but your book has changed my life. It's changed me. And I said, oh my gosh, this is interesting, Mike. Do tell. He said, well, remember how I doubted your whole idea about the bird plow and Cooper's hawks and the oppression, the big 100-yard quiet place that bird creates, And I said, yes, I remember you doubting that. He said, well, I was editing that part of the book, and I was staying at my sister's here in Texas, and I was editing that part of the book, and I heard some loud bird alarms. I saw out the window a bunch of birds fly off in what you would call a bullet, and they were ditching. And then through the open window, I could hear it got really quiet out there. Just a little while ago, there was all kinds of birds singing, and now it was dead quiet. And I said to myself, I got up from my computer and I said to myself, well, if Jon Young is telling the truth, and if he's right, if I walk out this door, there should be a Cooper's hawk within the middle of that 100-yard quiet spot. And John, I walked out that door, and there that Cooper's hawk was sitting right in the middle of that silence, just like you said. And I can't stop paying attention to bird language now. And ever since I started paying attention to bird language in the way that I am now, it's changing who I am. I can feel my perception changing. I can feel the way I experience the world. Even the way I see myself is shifting. He said, so this book changed me. Can we call it deep bird language? And I said, yes, by all means.
Wow.
And then I went back to my research team and I said, I think I figured out what makes us different from education, recreation, and connection. We are deep nature connection, not nature connection, because we are proactively strategizing how to use models to get people to these deeper connection results quicker, right?
And I've heard so many other similar stories of that. In fact, a professor that I work with at the University of Florida, Dr. Katie Sieving, who had been in the lab studying bird language for several decades and had made some incredible discoveries, especially related to parrots, titmice, and chickadees. But until she came across your work and got to do a bird sit with you, she said it had all become kind of dead to her. It was just information. It may be interesting, but really she was getting tired of it. And she said when she saw that, exactly like the story you're talking about, Cooper's hawk, it just opened a whole new world. It's like everything changed. It just made it all come alive for her. And reminded her why she got involved in this to begin with, and just gave her a completely different perspective. And that perspective was deep nature connection. So
That's I thank you for sharing that. And just, for the listeners, a parrot is not a parrot, but a parrot, P-A-R-I-D.
that's right.
Parrot.
Yeah.
And
Parrot.
that's just the name of a family, which includes chickadees and titmice. And when you say that Katie was in the lab, she also spent what, tens of thousands of hours in the field recording and observing chickadees and titmice, right?
She did, and has come to all kinds of conclusions, which goes beyond this podcast here, but that actually parrots or titmice chickadees are the sentries of the forest. They're the guardians. Everybody listens to them. They're essential for ecosystem health, and they're found throughout the world. A couple exceptions, but especially in the whole Arctic regions. And she actually is the one, or one of her grad students discovered that why fishing doesn't really work in South America, like in the Amazon, is because you don't have parrots there.
Mm.
And the acoustical signature of titmice and chickadees is very similar to when a human makes the psh, 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 psh sound. So that's why when I think most birders don't know this, but that's why fishing actually works because other birds tune into it like it was a titmice or chickadee who was alarming. So
Oh, that's amazing.
yeah, it is. And she's made many other discoveries too. And I think, as you like to say, and other people who study bird language in the field, is that science is now catching up to what, indigenous cultures have known and practiced for, thousands of years, right?
Absolutely. One of the things that fascinated me the most when I first met the Kalahari Bushmen, right? And this was a group of Bushmen that had not joined up with the reservation system, if you will, right? They were still living their original ways, and not unlike the Apaches in the story from grandfather there. But when I met those people and I met their children, I've never seen children from the age of 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 so alert to bird language. Like every time a bird alarm went off, all their heads turned. And I teach bird language to modern families, and there's children there who are super keen on wanting to learn it. Like they making their mom and dad learn it with them, and they're really excited about it, but they don't have that ability to pay attention to every little sound and change in the environment around them. And so I made up my mind at that point that I would go back and I would interview the Bushmen to figure out what they know about bird language, right? And I spent 2 weeks doing that, and it was one of the most fascinating 2 weeks of my life. And I went there with the assumption. Now listen to this assumption, okay? So I'm outing myself, okay? I went out with the assumption that the people who would know the most bird language would be the hunters, because they have to leave the village, 2 or 3 at a time, just 2 or 3 of them traveling together, going miles and miles from the village into the deep country, where they would encounter lions and hyenas, leopards, elephants, and musk, a lot of dangerous things, cobras and mambas and night adders and death adders and puff adders, right? So they were really at risk, and I just assumed, okay, they're going to know bird language like the back of their hand. And well, they know a lot more bird language than most, but it was the women, it was the mothers who knew the most bird language. And I was like, oh my God, how could I be so dumb? Of course, because the women go out without weapons, without men to protect them, to gather plant foods. And they've got children with them. And so they have to know the difference between a mongoose and a hyena. They can't make a mistake, because it could cost their children their lives. They have to be proactive and know where the lions are, and so that they could keep a couple of miles between them and the lions at all times, so that they don't have to encounter lions. And their knowledge of bird language was so nuanced and so detailed, and they, of course, were passing it on to the children. And I was like, yep, of course, the grandmothers. It's the grandmothers. Hello. The men didn't need to know, because they could use their weapons. And if they got into trouble at the last minute, it made for a good story back at the village anyway. Right?
Around the campfire.
Yeah. Yeah. When they got back and had an audience, people love when they tell stories that, oh, we accidentally bumped into lions. And then they tell these really funny stories, and, how so-and-so climbed a tree and got thorns in his hands and screamed. And, they love, the slapstick of it. Right. So they're less invested in knowing the nuance of every single thing that makes what Tom Brown would call a concentric ring. When a mongoose moves or a weasel moves, there's a concentric ring. When a snake moves, there's a concentric ring. And that means, how do the birds and animals react to the presence of another thing? And that's what bird language basically is, right? It's bird and animal language. It's not limited to birds. As you said, everybody listens to the titmice and the chickadees. Well, that includes the deer, that includes the coyote, right?
Well, I'm reminded as you talk about the Klaus Zuberbuehler story, doing his research in the Ivory Coast, I believe, listing all the 10 primates and then figuring out everything is listening. The birds are listening, the monkeys are listening, the birds, and ultimately he was able through acoustical analysis to interpret leopard calls. And that actually brings up a good point, is that with these disciplines like bird language or wildlife tracking, what is different about them? Why do you get nature connection out of those? And what are some of the attributes of nature connection versus some of the other things we talked about? Like, not there's anything wrong with it, but riding your mountain bike, through the woods.
Well, may I just say, I want to make super clear for the listeners that I don't like say this one's better than that one. And what I like to think about, especially in our modern times, is that we actually have to integrate recreation, education, and nature connection. And that deep nature connection accounts for all three of those, right? Because if I'm going to make deep connection through bird language to the birds and animals around where I live, I need to know the name of that one. So I need to look it up and I need to read about it. How big is its territory? What does it eat? What time of year does it mate? How many offspring does it have? So on, right? So deep nature connection inspires education. It also inspires recreation. And really what I'm saying is that we need all of it, right? We need all of it, but we got to balance them. And so the benefits of deep nature connection show up in what we call the attributes of deep nature connection. And there's a lot of research, by the way, that backs everything, single thing up that I'm about to say. That nature connection, when we get deep nature connection, we are happier. We are more vital, meaning we have more energy in our bodies. We're more motivated and curious. So happiness is one, that motivated, energized is another. We have the ability to listen to each other's stories in a really, really profoundly present way. So that makes the person who's telling the story to us feel that we're really there and listening. We call it unconditional listening or deep listening to other people's stories. And that benefits both the listener and the teller. The fourth attribute is that we develop a strong sense of empathy and connection, which makes us want to care for things, right? So we become more empathetic, which makes us better people, really. The fifth one is, when that empathy kicks in, we suddenly become internally motivated. And this is key. We are internally motivated, intrinsically motivated to want to make the world a better place. Like, okay, well, hey, I see all these things around me have a life to live, and can I do things to make it better for them? We might start thinking about how to redesign our landscaping, for instance, right, to make it more native bird friendly. Like people naturally start moving into that conservation ethic because they have deep nature connection. And Richard Louv identifies that in Last Child in the Woods. He basically said that all these children who grew up with nature connection from spending lots of time getting to know their place and those trees and those animals, that those are all the people that became volunteers and donors to the conservation movement. And ever since the 80s, the conservation movement has been shrinking in membership because as these elders pass away, no one in the next generation is picking that up because they don't have that level of connection anymore. So, conservation was driven by nature connection. And that is a really important, for me, a reason to do this work, to really be there to hold that in place.
I'm reminded as you say that the old adage, you only value what you love.
Mm-hmm.
And if I understand you correctly, our listeners, is I think to a large degree, nature connection is really essential for conservation.
Yes.
And the more you care about something, the more you're going to want to not only save it, but as you said, expand it. And interesting, as
Mm-hmm.
you're talking, I think I can hear a robin alarming in the background there.
Uh,
Uh, but that's really interesting. And maybe if you can expand on that a little more, In our culture today, we hear our society, we hear a lot about, meditation and awareness. But for me, one of the distinguishing factors of these disciplines like bird language is that that's exactly what they do. Rather than just blowing through nature or on a walk, again, not there's anything wrong with that. That's great. And I go out and do that sometimes or go for a run. But when you stop and really begin to tune into what's going on and take it all in, there's just something, it seems like in our DNA that it awakens something in us.
Yeah.
Um, and it seems essential and it's very gratifying in a way.
Hmm.
And it starts this whole lifelong process of not just from information, not so much like generating a life list for, number of birds you see, although that certainly comes with it because you're going to see more, but you become part of the story. And referenced earlier the Klaus Zuberbuehler story, if anybody can find that on the internet, but talks about when he's able to tune into these monkey calls and distinguish a leopard alarm, and then he realized that the leopard was following him, which was kind of scary on one part, but on another part, it was like he was part of the story. And it seems like to me that's an essential part of nature connection.
Well, yeah, and deep nature connection, that's a guarantee, that you start to realize that you will become part of the story. Like, how you said that, if you go out there with all your senses tuned, then you start to feel like you're part of the story. But here's the thing that listeners should really think about. Do you think you're not part of the story already? Like right now, if you walked out the door and walked 100 yards away from your house into the the landscape around you, the birds and animals would talk about you. And I like to ask this question to people because what are they saying about you? The moment you become aware that they're talking about you, whether you like it or not, and just because you think you're not part of the story doesn't mean that you are not part of the story, right? You are automatically. And when people walk through the landscape thinking that they're not part of the story and they're just sitting there thinking in their heads as they're walking, and they might be enjoying the walk, and it's a pleasurable day out, the temperature's just right and it feels good to be out. But they may not think that the birds are giving them the time of day. But I'll tell you right now that if I was there, I would know you were coming 2 minutes before you arrived because the birds would talk about you in a way that would tell me that you were coming with that lack of awareness. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. The birds are talking about you. And the moment you realize that is the moment that you begin to enter into that conversation consciously and intentionally. And that drives deep nature connection, that kind of level of intention and awareness. And it's a routine. It's not something that happens on your first walk out, although it might. It's really about building up your nervous system to awaken those things that Lee was referencing that we're born with. We're hardwired for this. It kept our ancestors alive. But there's benefits to it. It isn't just that it'll keep you from getting eaten by a lion. It's also that it activates those attributes of connection. And I gave you the first five, right? Happiness, vitality, uh, unconditional listening capacity, empathy, and wanting to be helpful. The sixth one is when it kicks in at a deeper level, and that's when you start to feel what we call in Coyote's Guide to Connecting to Nature, which, by the way, is a great book on this whole topic if you're interested. Coyote's Guide to Connecting with Nature by myself, Ellen Haas, and Evan McGowan. We talk about it as awe and reverence. Like you start to really appreciate just being alive. You're just like, oh my gosh, I woke up another day and I get to be here. And this is such a magical planet that we live on. And, oh, isn't it so beautiful? Like that's a wonderful, wonderful attribute. We also call it being fully alive, really appreciating life. So that's number 6. And number 7, and this is also known, connection, as Lee referenced earlier, we will preserve what we love, and we love only what we develop connection to. So I've come to recognize that developing connection capacity increases our capacity to be loving, forgiving, and to hold that compassionate space for others, which is so lacking in modern times. It's a recipe for building love. So that's the 7th attribute. And the 8th attribute, which is also kind of what I call the keystone attribute, is the quiet mind. And Lee referenced that a little bit earlier. That's what changed Mike, the writer, right? All of a sudden, he's listening to bird language all the time. So now his mind goes quiet. And when your mind goes quiet, your creativity increases. You begin to hear your own inner creative voice coming up. The quiet voice within you begins to be louder. So your intuition increases, your creativity increases. It's the quiet mind, we call it. And it's the keystone attribute, because if you start people off exercising the quiet mind by expanding their senses on a routine basis and teaching them bird language so that they want to pay attention all the time, the quiet mind will come on quicker, and that drives the other attributes faster.
Wow, I love that. And I especially like the part you were talking about it being a conversation. I'm reminded of the poet David White, who is always talking about having a conversation with reality. And he's a naturalist, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I think that's such a salient point, because actually a conversation is happening. We just haven't been tuning into it. In fact, when I teach bird language, I like to say it's almost like let's say we're growing up in a house and you had another family living with you who was speaking a foreign language, but you couldn't understand it. You never learned that language. And then later on, you say go to college, you study that, and then you come back, and then you're able to tune in to what they're saying. And then you realize this whole time they were telling you these things like, hey, you left the window open, milkman left a jar of milk at the door, or hey, your brother just stole your allowance for the week out of your jar, right? And you had no idea this was going on. So just the fact that you weren't tuned into it or aware of it doesn't mean it's not happening.
Right.
And then I think the other point that you make is that when you do tune into it, then your response becomes different, and then nature starts treating you differently. And I know that one of your big things is increasing, when you're out in nature, increasing your zone of awareness, and thereby diminishing your zone of disturbance.
Exactly. Yeah, that Dan Gradoki pioneered that concept, that principle. He was thinking about, well, we were working on What the Robin Knows. He was a science editor, and I'd been mentoring him since he was 15 years old. And he went on to get his master's in science and became a formidable naturalist and birder, just incredible, incredible ecologist. But he was the one, when we were writing the book, he says, I think I understand the goal of What the Robin Knows, the book itself. Like, what we're really trying to do is get people to, because I like to say it this way, people wear their zone of awareness like a wetsuit. In modern times, we're so busy in our heads, we absolutely, our awareness is basically at our skin. We wear it so tight against us. We're not stretching out into the ecosystem around us. And then when we walk in the landscape with our awareness really pulled in, we create a very big disturbance. And when you push your awareness out and you really push it out there and you listen to the quietest sound, and as far as you can hear, to your left, out in front of you, behind you, out to your right, above you, and even at the ground level below your feet, when you really stretch out and try to listen to all those places at the same time, your awareness gets really big and your disturbance gets really small. I mean, the moment you stretch your awareness like that, and you can hold it like that from practicing for a while, it doesn't take that long. But the moment you can hold that awareness really big and walk in that way, you'll start to see a lot more wildlife, because the birds won't be as freaked out by you. And so they're not given warnings of your approach. People like me won't perceive you coming from 2 minutes away.
So, John, our culture, obviously, or perhaps lack thereof, um, has, as you said earlier, moved away from having a connection to nature over, several decades.
Well, more than that. I mean, honestly, it started, you can go back, like if I look at my English ancestors, I can go back and say that my English ancestors lost their culture when the Romans completely destroyed them, right? 2,000 years ago, so to speak, plus or minus. My Irish ancestors lost it when the English, who had lost their culture, went and destroyed them. Um, my Polish ancestors, I can't pin it down because the Polish were being conquered left and right all the time through history. So it's hard to know when the Polish lost that really deep nature connection pattern that they used to have. But so yes, let's just say that there was a big shift in, the 80s, right? But there was an even bigger shift, centuries ago, where when you go with the Bushmen that I visited in Botswana, they never shifted, right? They're still in their original culture, and they deliberately formed an intentional community so they could maintain that, not unlike, grandfather's people during the Apache Wars. So there are pockets around the world where people are still living that really deep nature connection culture so that everybody gets nature connected in every generation. But that's getting very rare now. And I'm trying to document and research as much as I can before we lose that completely, because I think the world needs it now more than ever.
So how do we get that back in your estimation? And, we hear a lot, particularly like social media, about connection, but of course there's a lot of studies showing now, or movies like The Social Dilemma, where not for everyone, but it can do the exact opposite,
Right.
especially
Yeah.
with kids. So how, in your view, and again, on two levels, I guess. One is just the personal attributes and all the things that, you mentioned earlier, just all the things we need as individual humans. How do we get that back? And then also, as it relates to conservation and, helping the planet, if you will, from the standpoint of species and landscapes and overall ecology. What do you think we need to do as a society slash culture?
Well, that's a big design challenge, Lee. Um, and I think we should tease apart two things, right? One of them is, let's just say any individual listener who's hearing this conversation says, hey, I want to get started, right? So there's like an individual approach, right? Because it's literally right outside our door, right outside our window, right now. We don't have to go anywhere. We don't have to go to the Kalahari and be raised among the Bushmen to have this, because we're already hardwired for it, which means that you already have the software inside you. It's just waiting to be activated, right? It's already there. You were born with it, right? So it's not like you have to go get a master's degree in this in order to have it. You just have to wake it up. Best way
Yeah.
to do that, I'm doing it right now. You heard that sound in the background. That sounded like a robin. That was actually a olive-sided flycatcher giving its peep 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 call, which does sound an awful lot like a robin. Um, the I sit here multiple times a day. It's just a patio with a chair, and right now, as I'm talking to you, I got a junco 5 feet off of my left foot right now, just hanging around, scratching in the grass, completely comfortable with my presence. um, I build relationships right outside my door. I come out here and I listen for the quietest sound. I sit in my chair, and if I have to be on a Zoom call like I am right now, I'll do it out here because, as I'm talking to you, another junco's landing right in front of me, right? So I can watch bird language and be in this conversation at the same time. And I can integrate this nature connection core routine of sitting and observing and getting to know my neighbors. The Bushman would say, when you first see that bird and you've never seen it before, and it looks at you and you look at it, and there's that moment of mutual recognition, between two beings, a thread will form between you, right? And over time, that thread will become a string, it'll become a cord, it'll become a rope. And when it becomes a rope, then that empathy is there, And so I have a relationship with my juncos now. I know where their nests are. I know how many young they had. I know the wild turkeys that hang around here. I know when the lion killed a turkey and that the turkeys abandoned this place for 5 days because of the trauma of losing one of the hens who had babies with her. I know where the other hen, because there was two hens together raising 6 chicks together. They each had so many, and they brought them together so the two moms could co-parent. And I know that when the lion killed the one hen, the other hen went a mile north of here and landed at my neighbor's place, because he said suddenly another mother showed up with a bunch of babies, and now there's 3 mothers, and now there's 18 babies collectively. And he said just a couple of days ago there was only 12 and 2 moms. I'm like, oh, I know who that is. So I am just constantly curious. And, I come out here day and night. I come out here first thing in the morning for the dawn chorus. I'm here at twilight when the sun's going down over the trees. And I know this place through the seasons and through the times of day. But, as far as I'm concerned, I'm paying rent for this place So I'm also paying tuition for my deep nature connection journey, because I don't have to get in the car and drive to a park to have this. I've got trees, I've got grass, I've got birds right here. I've got squirrels, I've got deer, coyotes, lions, bobcats, they're all moving through, and I'm paying attention all the time. And I'm always asking questions. I'm super curious, and I share the questions with my partner, Sarah, and she's always working on questions. And the two of us talk every evening about what we saw today and what the Junko showed us, and we're sharing stories and listening to each other in that deep way. This is how you do it for yourself. It's right there outside your door, and people are like, well, I live in LA in a high rise. I can't. I'm like, no, you can, and I was visiting with some friends. In fact, the people who were sponsoring me for the TED Talk, the people who ran that TEDx down in Grant Park, LA, where I did my TEDx talk, they were really questioning whether or not this would work for them because they lived way up high in a high rise. And I said, yeah, come on, let's do it right now. We went out on their patio where they could see over the city, and we went to the window and we watched the pigeons. And I said, do you see how those pigeons are acting? There's a hawk around here somewhere. Let's look, and then I spotted the red-tailed hawk sitting on another high rise, and they're like, oh my God, it works here too. I'm like, yes, it does. We can't make the excuse that we can't get to the Kalahari, so I'll never get nature connected because I can't go to the Bushman. No, that's not how it is. The moment you choose to stretch your awareness bigger than your disturbance is the moment you enter into the conversation, is the moment you begin your journey. And Coyote's Guide will take you all a long way. If you just listen to what's in Coyote's Guide, it will totally take you all the way. We wrote that book for you. So if you want to go on the journey, you can start in your own backyard. And yeah, that's the first. Like I said, I'm teasing apart what needs to be done at a societal level versus what needs to be done at an individual level.
Well, that's great. I think that's the hope, that it's already within everybody. It's not, this isn't only a chosen few or selected. Everybody has this within them. And I'm reminded, I've heard you say before, of, people are not aware of what they're not connected to, but there's this idea of, like with the Bushmen in Africa, of unconscious competence, right?
Right.
That once you start doing this, it's like you do become competent in nature connection, and you get all these attributes, and you don't have to, go get a master's in it, right? Or overthink it. It's just something that can come naturally to us.
Right. I mean, it literally comes naturally. That's the whole point, right? People sometimes feel guilty when they go on the nature connection journey because it's so much fun and it doesn't feel like they're doing anything. And I'm like, well, no, that's probably because you're doing it right. It's natural. It comes to us naturally, right? So it feels like nothing, but it has residual impact. Like you'll build a critical mass of reawakening, calibrating, and habilitating your nervous system. Because my friend Kathleen, who's an occupational therapist, uses nature connection as a clinical tool. And it works better than the clinical tools that she was trained in occupational therapy. She's really convinced bird language is one of the most powerful ways to do occupational therapy with modern children. And she said, people think that I rehabilitate the human nervous system, but I woke up one day at like 3 a.m. and I just said out loud, you can't rehabilitate something that hasn't been habilitated in the first place.
Mm.
Right. And that's what it is. We're born with the potential for calibrating and habilitating this amazing nervous system that we possess. But modern life doesn't call us to do that. So it just waits in the background for someone to unpack it, and that someone is just you. It's just your choice to awaken that which is already inside of you, and turn on that original operating system, that's there. It just hasn't been exercised because no one asked it to be.
Yeah, and I think the beauty of a lot of these is that when you connect several of these things, like bird language or wildlife tracking, I like to term it as end-to-end experiences. I know you brought up earlier, I do a lot of fishing as well, and you were fishing as a kid. And, a lot of times you go fishing now, it's just you've got whatever the gear is, a rod, you land a big fish, and, it's great. And I do catch and release and let it go. And, there's some joy there, but it's so much better when you are really tuned in. And I can remember even just a few years ago where I didn't have a rod with me and I found a piece of line and I had kind of made a hook out of something else and I carried it along the bank and I caught this one fish. I think I was camping, and then I ended up actually scaling it and eating it. And just that whole thing of doing the entire thing was so much more rewarding. It was only a small fish, it didn't matter. But this kind of end-to-end experience that when
Yeah.
you start getting out doing these things, you're using your hands, or if you're a hunter, you make your own bow. Or I remember one time even I was traveling for a year. I was on the road a lot, and I just had to mend my own clothes, my socks. But it was just something about putting those on that I had repaired the holes, even though I didn't actually make the sock to begin with. There was just something about that, and I think these type of activities that you're talking about really go to that of just getting people more connected.
Hmm. You know how simple it is? Like this woman was saying to me, I was in Georgia, I was teaching outside of Athens, and there was this woman, she said, I can't really do this nature connection thing with my kids because I'll be outside with them for a little while and then I got to go inside and prepare them dinner. And I said, well, do you have a barbecue? And she said, oh yeah, well, yes, I do. And I said, well, what if you all just stayed outside and just cooked things on the barbecue together? She's like, oh, that's brilliant. So sometimes it's just rethinking it, a little bit, right? How can we call those subsistence living skills, right?
Yes.
And that's one of the 13 core routines in Coyote's Guide that, will get people into deep nature connection. So we have a 2-car garage, and we open up that 2-car garage, and right outside there's our table and our barbecue, because we as a family will eat outside every time we can, right? Why not? Why not integrate cooking into your nature connection routines? You can do it. I mean, we did it for what, 200,000 years prior to modern times.
Yes, absolutely. Well, John, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. I don't know if you have any other last comments, but I think you covered so much ground in this. And I think above all, from, a nature connection standpoint, is hopefully our listeners have gotten that how important it is to them personally. And then obviously on the conservation front, what that can lead to and how it can really be transformative on both levels.
Yeah, well, my only closing comment is kind of a reflection on the big question you asked me earlier. you know and I said, let's tease apart what has to be done on an individual level versus a societal level, right? And I just want to underline that the benefits that you get from practicing the deep nature connection core routines is well-being, more happiness, more vitality, more connection, more love. These are all good things for us. And I've never heard a person say, after they've been on the deep nature connection journey, please give me back my old unaware self. No one has ever said that. They've never asked the money back guarantee. I want my old unaware self back. So the benefits are clear for the individual. And on a societal level, we have to influence the conversation of the mainstream world, which I've been doing a lot of in the last 20 years, to really embrace what is connection, because connection has fallen out of our understanding. When we think of connection, we think of it in terms of whether my phone is connected or not, right? Do I have a good enough connection to do a Zoom call? But what does connection really mean? And how do we get to it? What is the best way to enhance connection? And, Richard Louv, after he and I talked about this, after he wrote the Nature Principle, which was the book that followed The Last Child in the Woods, he and I were co-leading keynotes at an event. And after he heard me speak, he said to me in the back room after the speech, John, I think this deep nature connection thing is really the most important thing, and we need to influence society at all levels to embrace what they've lost, because it's really fallen out of modern awareness. And I've been committed to that. It's a strategy. What I try to do is link together the practitioners of deep nature connection globally so that they are forming a practitioners network where they can support each other and, trade skills and ideas. And also, like, when somebody has to run a summer camp and they need more nature connection instructors, they can, borrow from each other's communities, and that network is now global. So that's one way that I'm helping to influence that, is to support a global network of practitioners of deep nature connection mentoring. So, and there's other ways, but you're doing it right now, Lee. This podcast is a really great contribution to the societal effort. So thank you for doing it, and thanks for listening, everybody.
Yeah, and thank you again, John, for your time. And yeah, for everyone out there, find a wilderness school, an instructor near you. There's all kinds of great programs out there. And again, thank you so much for your time, John. It's been a wonderful experience, and look forward to see what you come up with next.
Thanks, Lee.
Okay.